Excuse me, guys. Didn't mean for you guys to hear that. But welcome to Cast. I am your host, Cassidy Streeter, and today we look ahead for at the divisional round of the playoffs. Excuse me. Of course, tomorrow. So let me. So last week we have, Chiefs, Packers, and Chief Pack. Yeah, Chiefs, Packers, Bills, coming up on top, along with, the Lions as well over, their matchup, and then Tampa Bay. And this week we get to see, the first seeds for our first time in a while, in a couple weeks. I say a while, but a lot of things I think go into it. At Baltimore, they rested, obviously, a lot of their starters the final week. San Fran did somewhat the similar thing where a lot of their guys did not play the final week. So most notably Purdy, Kittle, but and Bosa. But you know, I've watched a few interviews this week, and it seems to me like, San Fran is looking at this game a little bit and taking it a bit more seriously than what the Cowboys would. I mean, not to say maybe the Cowboys did take it seriously, but they certainly didn't show it against the Packers. And then of course Houston being another team that people doubted and, you know, kind of thought it was a foregone conclusion where they would lose to the Browns. With Detroit, they eked out, and I do mean eke out against the Rams. I think it was, somewhat bad officiating at the end of the game. And then you, of course, got, Tampa Bay beating the Eagles soundly. The Eagles obviously, seal their fate as one of the worst collapses we've seen at the end of the year. Kansas City handled the Dolphins in a game that I don't think was close at all. I think they really could have held them to like 3 points. But they kind of let, Tyreek slip through their fingers one time where it looked like poor tackling and just overall, kind of bad defense that kicked them into high gear, to be honest. And of course, the fourth coldest game in NFL history. Buffalo, of course, as we know, handling the Steelers on Monday. And clearly they came in with a purpose, and I think Pittsburgh really suffered without TJ Watt, of course. But looking to this weekend, we of course have both number one seeds on Saturday, which I thought was kind of interesting. Only because, I mean, obviously, you think of the Sunday games as maybe being a bit more tight knit because the number one seeds play the lowest remaining. And Houston obviously is the fourth seed in the AFC, but Houston I think has kind of proved that they're going to play hard, and the young team is going to continue to just kind of push the bill for what they're capable of. Nico Collins, CJ Stroud, on the offense. the emergence of Singletary, kind of being a consistent back for them for the most part and emerging later in the season here. And then, of course, you have Baltimore, the currently, still my Super Bowl favorites, to be honest with you, because of the way that they handled San Fran and the way they closed out the season. I don't think there's anyone that really, I would say, holds a candle to them. I mean, I think there's teams that can compete with them, but I think that they just have the most well rounded team. Um, Let me look little bit more in depth to this game. With the Texans and the Ravens, obviously this is in Baltimore as well. The Ravens finished the season 13-4, and then you've got the Texans who finished 10-7, so close somewhat on the spectrum of what their record was. Obviously, Houston a bit more inconsistent, but they are a younger team. CJ Stroud and Lamar Jackson did play in the first week. And you think about that kind of things. You think about what happened, and Jackson had turned the ball over 3 times in that game, and he also threw, but Jackson also threw for 365 yards, which I don't think is that accurate of the Texan defense now. If Jackson throws for 365 yards now, maybe it'll just show kind of a matchup issue for the Texans that they'll need to overcome in order to beat the Ravens next year should they play again. But, obviously now the other thing that you have to think about is that Dalvin Cook was signed by the Ravens. I think that they're trying to shore up some talent there, reinvigorate Cook, because clearly he wasn't who we knew him as with the Jets, and that could quite possibly be because of bad O line, different offense, and the fact that he's competing with Breece Hall for snaps, and I think that the Ravens, they don't really need a back that's going to carry it for 100 yards every game because they do have a pretty good, rushing attack with Lamar as well, who's put up a good amount of yards this year. And the Ravens also have just a team that, has good weapons and, overall just all around solid weapons for Lamar to throw it to. I don't think I really need to go over the names. I think at this point it's pretty apparent. And I think, the Texans, I'm just uncertain of whether or not they're going to be ready to play against this caliber of a team. I think that Stroud has looked really good. Don't get me wrong, and he did, and I mean he only had to throw it 21 times last week. But I feel like in a game like this, where the potential for high scoring from the Ravens, um, I just worry about the Texans' ability to slow down Jackson's arm as well as his rushing. And I mean, Jim Harbaugh, has been kind of waiting, I guess, patiently to be able to get into the playoffs with a pretty healthy team. And the Ravens are a pretty healthy team this year, minus their halfback situation. But I don't think that takes too much from their team, you know. So thinking about a score for this game, they give a 9.5 point advantage to the Ravens, which I'll be real, I think is maybe a little bit of a stretch, but not impossible. So I'm going to go with the Ravens, and I think that the Ravens score 30 in this game, and the Texans score 23, because I really don't see Stroud being held to less than 2 touchdowns, and I think that, they're gonna be able to move the ball pretty well against Baltimore because Stroud has just had a very good season, and I mean, as a Houston as someone who's been kinda looking at Houston quite a bit, they've earned this spot, of where they're at and proved all the doubters wrong, but I just think that they're gonna go up against something where the Baltimore Ravens are just too loaded and too experienced to really give any leniency to the Texans. Because even the Browns last week, I mean, obviously they didn't play up to their potential. Houston did a really good job of protecting Stroud, and don't get me wrong, I think if they protect Stroud, they can that'll be one of their keys to victory, and they have done a very good job this year of doing that. But I think that Baltimore, they've just been notorious at getting pressure from numerous spaces. So that's the reason why I think the Texans are going to lose this game after, what is still a good season for them. Moving on, we have, arguably like the top game of the week that I think everyone is interested in. We have my Green Bay Packers going to San Francisco to take on the Niners. I think the Niners are poised to do a really good job. Are poised to do a really good job. And I mean, they give my Packers kind of the same treatment where it's a 9.5 point underdogs to the Niners. And I think that looking at this game, I can't help but say that I think the way the Packers are playing, they're winning as a team. Everyone is going 110%, arguably, maybe some a little bit more than others, you know. But the thing that I look at in this game with the Niners is that we obviously have, the Niners being the 1 seed, but having kind of that inconsistent stretch of games from Purdy. And I think that, the Packers, we have a pretty good pass rush. And while we didn't get a ton of pressure on Dak Prescott, we were still able to sack him quite a bit of times. And I think that Purdy, from what we've seen this season, as an honest assessment, is that he has had some times where he just does not do well and he makes bad decisions. And I think that with how the Packers played last week, I think that I think that my Packers can, sway the game in their favor by making Brock Purdy uncomfortable. It's been talked about a lot this week, and even in the Nick Bosa interview, that he's like, I don't think teams have made Jordan Love uncomfortable. But the interesting thing about that is it's not like teams haven't been getting pressure towards Love. He's just handled it so well. Looking at Packers in San Francisco, obviously San Fran has owned the Packers number for every playoff matchup they had against us when Rodgers was the quarterback. And I do think it wasn't all Rodgers' fault. Obviously, the Packers having kind of a shitty defense in the past, where we were susceptible to the run. I remember the Kaepernick, Raheem Mostert, games where it's like, oh yeah, let's just get completely scorched in the run. And, clearly, the San Franciscos have a better running back now, but they use McCaffrey differently than what the old, offense had used for their other running backs. And, don't get me wrong, I think that, they're going to run it. They're going to try to play tough football type of thing. Will be their strategy in the run and be physical on the line. But I think that, in terms of how my Packers have been playing, and they've been playing tough, I think that we can limit their run and force them to pass, which obviously we all know that San Francisco probably has the most loaded offense, in terms of passing. They plug McCaffrey out. They obviously have Ayuk, Debo, Kittle, and any one of them can have big plays. Um, the thing that I guess I've been really happy with what Barry's been doing is he's been willing to play the guys at the line a little bit more. Not all the time, because I think that gets predictable, and you can obviously have guys that are experienced like Debo and Ayuk who are slippery, escape, past the first, the DB, and have big plays. And especially if Purdy isn't getting pressure, because he does throw pretty accurate passes. I will say this year, I think he's had a little bit more of a humbling experience where not all of his passes have been as accurate as when he was playing last year in his rookie season. I'm not trying to just make this about Purdy and knocking him and being my Packers avenue to winning, because I think that, with our defense, I think we can be stout enough, and we don't even have to rely on him making mistakes in order to give us a chance. But the San Francisco defense is another one of those where I think that their pass rush speaks for itself, a lot like the Cowboys. But then, we played the Cowboys, and you know, I saw Zach Tom on an ESPN reel this week where, they were like, oh, underrated dogs or whatever it was. And they showed Zach Tom up against Micah Parsons, and he didn't give up anything. And he's been having a phenomenal and late year into the postseason, where clearly he could easily, I mean, if he keeps this up, barring injuries or decline in play, I think that Zach Tom could easily be one of the best right tackles in the league, in a few years. But if he keeps playing like this, it's going to give Bosa young problems. Not that it's any discredit to them. They dominate most of the matchups that they're in, at least for Bosa. I think that Young is good, but he's definitely not as elite as Bosa. And you also have Eric Armstead on, San Fran, that I'm pretty sure is healthy for this game. But we also have like Elton Jenkins, who's been playing really, really well, and they showed his grades for blocking as well, and has had one of the highest run blocking grades, which is very solid for a guard. And it's just one of those things that it's like you look at these teams. The one thing that I would say is kind of worrisome about the Niners defense is that Trey Greenlaw had that injury weeks ago, and he's questionable to play. I'm sure he goes, but overall, I think obviously it's going to be a tough game. I think that my Packers, are just going to go about what they've been doing, and they zone out all the noise. They do what they want to do, and they try to run it to perfection. And I think that, we saw last week a defense that had to commit to the run quite a bit. They were stacking the box for Aaron Jones and the Cowboys against the Packers. And there was some times that it was looking like, oh, are we going to get the run game going? But eventually that kind of collapsed once the Packers opened up the pass game, because the Cowboys defense realized, and Dan Campbell realized that, hey, we can't just shore up for the run every play. But this is going to be an interesting game. I do know that Christian Watson, who didn't really do too much in terms of catching last week, but apparently pulled defenders, was played last week, and this week he's off of the injury report. But so the Packers for the most part are going to be at full strength. Obviously, we have Aaron Jones, who's been playing as good as any back the last 4 weeks now, with the most yards and rushing. And obviously, last week we also had Romeo Dobbs pop off for a crazy game where we didn't even need to have Reed or Wicks involved that much, you know. And it was the Dobbs, Jones, and Love show last week, in my opinion, where, I mean, you had other guys who caught, footballs at other points in the game, but for the most part, those were the guys who were the stars last week. And, it's like I said, the Packers last week played up against a tough, they played up against a tough O-line, but were still able to sack quite a bit. And I would even be willing to say that I guess, I think that Dak Prescott's a little bit more mobile than Purdy. I feel like I've never really seen Purdy scramble really that much. And not especially not for like, big gains where he can exploit you with that. But looking at this game, I think it's going to be very, very close. I actually don't really know who to go with because I think that, you know, I honestly believe that I think you can simmer down and you can kind of not be as locked in when you have a bye week, but these guys essentially had 2 weeks where they didn't, play a football game, some of the stars on San Francisco, and it's like, well, that helps you get healthy. Sometimes you lose some of that focus and that confidence if you're just taking too much time off and you're not. So it's like, I think this is going to be a really close game. I really don't know how to call it, to be honest with you. I think that, God, it's just, I think that my Packers, despite only getting in with a 9-8 record, they're playing, a lot better football. And if they had played the kind of football that they're playing this year, I think that they could have easily been the 1 seed, I guess, because we really didn't have that tough of a schedule, but looking at this, it is in San Fran, but it's like you could say the same thing about how it was in Dallas. And, I'm going to give the favor to the more experienced team in the Niners. And that's the only edge I really think that I can give them because, I mean, you could say it's biased that I'm a Packers fan, but I really think that this game is a lot more even than what the over-under is saying with 9.5. So I am going to go with the Niners, but I'm going to go with the Niners and I'm going to say it's going to be like a 31 to 30 point game is my prediction, and it could come down to who has the final possession, to be honest with you. Our next game is probably pretty anticipated. We have Tampa Bay and Detroit on Sunday. And obviously Detroit winning last week, a game where they have to feel kind of fortunate that they won. Goff did not look that good in the second half, not doing very much. Tampa Bay, they handled a struggling Eagles team, so they kind of have, they have more to prove, I feel like, than more to prove, I guess, this week than Detroit did. Like, Detroit at least played gritty and they weren't willing to, like, give up, at the end. Albeit it's like there should have been, like, a penalty that could have been game changing. But, looking at this game, Detroit healthy, Tampa Bay pretty healthy. I mean, you have Godwin. Godwin and Shaquille Barrett are questionable, but I'm sure they'll be ready to go. And then on Detroit, they still list Sam Laporta, but he obviously had a day last week, and clearly it doesn't affect him. But I guess, the thing about the Rams is that people were saying before the game that, oh, the Rams haven't defended tight ends very well all year, so who knows? I do think Tampa Bay just has generally better linebackers with obviously Levante David, Bush, and obviously Shaquille Barrett's just not a cover guy, so I'm not gonna say him, but I think they have better coverage linebackers than the Rams have, because the Rams defense is in a rebuilding state. With that being said, I think that Tampa Bay and Detroit, I think this could be, somewhat of a tough challenge for Tampa Bay, in the sense that, like, yes, they're primarily a passing team, but I I just don't the amount of I mean, I do think White is a good piece at running back. I just don't think they fully know how to harness him or have the O line to really dominate for him. He's had games here and there that have been really good. He didn't really do much. Detroit has a good run defense. And I'm not saying Baker's gonna, throw a ton of picks or something like that. I think that he does a good job as any to escape out and try to keep a play alive, but Detroit just went up against like Puka Nakua, and the thing about Tampa Bay to me is their inconsistency this year. It's why they were 9-8 in the weakest division in football, and they clearly, they won that division, but it was never like, oh, they have this division on lockdown. But thinking about this, I think that Detroit is going to try to run all over Tampa Bay. I think they're going to use Montgomery a lot, and then they're going to plug in Gibbs, you know. I think that Tampa Bay is going to have to throw it, to win it this game, and it just hasn't been convincing to me. Yes, you had Evans with another 1,000-yard season, but you have possibly banged up Godwin, and I just don't think you have very many weapons besides that, like you used to, that are like, oh, we should be scared of this guy. And I think it's a good opportunity for the Lions to show that they can do a good job against, some good wide receivers who don't really have a fallback option that would scorch you and, burn you because of that. I'm going to go with Detroit. With Detroit, they give them a 6.5 point advantage. I think that they're going to return to kind of their scoring ways, because last week, yes, they played a weaker defense, but, to go an entire half, I think that they're just, I think that they're going to chip away at this Tampa team. And I expect, Amon-Ra to have another big game. But looking at this, I'm going to say Detroit, and I'm going to say I think Detroit wins 28-20 in this game. I know that's an 8-point difference, but I think that Detroit, I think that stadium's going to absolutely be raucous again. So I think Detroit comes home with a win, and they go to their first NFC championship since who knows when, to be honest. Moving on to our last game, we have Buffalo Bills again hosting the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously both teams being 11-6, but with Buffalo holding the advantage over Kansas City, so they were the second seed. And, Kansas City, obviously this weekend they do say that it's going to be cold again in Buffalo, which isn't a shock to me. This is one of those games where Buffalo, that they just played in kind of some, cold weather. It's always been talked about that if, the playoffs were to run through Buffalo, nobody's going to want to play there because of how unbearably cold and miserable it is. Kansas City, they obviously just played a game in like what was windy and the fourth coldest game. So I think that, this becomes kind of an interesting matchup where essentially, the two rivals of, teams that have been playing. And, for the most part, the Chiefs have gotten the better of the Bills the last, like 5 years or whatever it is since, the Mahomes and Allen eras and on their respective teams. And, the thing that I'd like to say about this game, I think, is that Buffalo runs the ball well, but it is very sporadic. And then you have Kansas City, where clearly they want to use Pacheco a lot. It's clear that they want to have him involved. They want to have a structured offense that isn't void of a running game, because that just, I mean, you become way too one-dimensional. But, Isaiah Pacheco has been doing such a good job, lately, and is such a spark plug that I think that even though the Bills have a very tough and rugged defense, it is going to come down to really how much they can limit Pacheco. Don't get me wrong, I think Mahomes will do what Mahomes does, but the passing game wasn't anything to saint home about. I think that the main reason the Kansas City won last week was because of their defense holding the Dolphins down. And I don't think they're going to be able to do that against Buffalo. So, looking at injuries, you do have Diggs questionable. He's obviously going to play, you know. With the Chiefs, Kadarius Toney questionable, Justin Ross questionable, and then you obviously have had Sky Moore on IR. So they have a banged up wide receiver core that mostly is Rashee Rice, Valdez Scantling, and then Kelsey. But thinking about the Chiefs, I just don't think that they have that guy who has emerged as a factor. I thought Kelsey would for sure emerge as kind of, what him and Mahomes do as one of those dynamic QB to tight end duos that dominates in the postseason. But even against a struggling defense of the Dolphins, Kelsey had I would say a below average game last week. And I don't think it's going to get easier with the Bills. The Bills, play a very tough defense. I think they overall have a better pass rush as well than the Chiefs overall. Not to say I don't think Chris Jones can still like take over a game type of thing. But looking at this game, I do think Buffalo holds the edge. I also think they hold the edge because I think that Allen is kind of realizing his potential. Excuse me, especially after last week where it's like he had that 52-yard run and he just looks like a man on a mission essentially, where I know that Mahomes can scramble too, but Allen is just a brutal and harsh runner. And not to say that the Chiefs defense isn't going to give him some problems, but I think that he's finally realizing how he has to play in order to not turn it over. Obviously last week it's like he went up against, the the Bills, didn't go up against like the best. They didn't go up against the best defense, and especially without TJ Watt in the Steelers, but they're still a pretty opportunistic defense. And the way that Allen had been throwing the ball in that final week against Miami just made me wonder, like, is he going to fix this, hopefully? And is this going to put a shock to his system? And the Buffalo Bills, interestingly enough, when Josh Allen hasn't had a turnover, they're 11-0. And I think that he knows as much as anybody that turnovers in the postseason, of course, are a kryptonite to most teams. So, if he can really just hold it down to where he doesn't turn the ball over, I think that they win this game. So I'm going to go with Bills. And this is kind of, and here's the thing about, the Chiefs too, is that they haven't ever played a game away from home in the postseason. So it's going to be something kind of new for like Mahomes, where he's not going to be able to be as comfortable with the home crowd, is one random tidbit that, I'd also like to mention. So looking at this game, they give it 2.5-point favorites, which I think is, pretty accurate. And I would like to say that I think the game's going to come down to the wire and it's going to be like a 24-23 game or something like that. So in favor of Buffalo. That goes on with the game analysis. There are a couple things that I want to talk to about with you guys for that are watching to put this on the book. But I wanted to bring up, I guess, the thing that many saw as extremely negative with the Packers and ultimately a player that used to play for the team. And he said, "Oh, it's okay to commit the personal foul." And I would say I wholeheartedly disagree with it. The Packers this year have played extremely clean football. You look at our dirtiest player last year, and it's not even to say that he was necessarily a dirty player on the field, but that he got a lot of personal fouls and even ejected from a game, was Quay Walker. Obviously, this year, he hasn't gotten ejected. I think he's had maybe one penalty that was like a personal foul called on him that might have been unjust. But overall, it's like, I mean, if it happens once, it could be a mistake. If it becomes a consistent thing, then yeah, you need to worry, But overall, my Packers, it's like, when have we ever played dirty like that? I know that I've been a fan of the team since '05, and I've never known the Packers to really be a team that has been dirty. It's always been other teams, that have been dirty in the league. Like I remember the Ndamukong and Suh Lions, where Suh would try to injure Rodgers, be just a complete D-bag to him, and then yeah, I think of other teams too, like obviously the Saints and Bountygate. It's one reason why I don't have much respect for Peyton anymore, is it's like, this is insane. You guys had to essentially injure Brett Favre in that game and ruin their Super Bowl hopes that year on the Vikings, which I'm not going to lie, I thought it was kind of cool that Brett Favre went and he was dominating with another team. I'm not one of those that has extreme prejudice towards everyone else in my division, and I like to see the bigger picture of like what teams are doing and what they like to do and what they do well, rather than being some short-sighted media bot that just pretty much discounts everything a team does just because they're not winning very much. But there's obviously been other dirty teams. And it's like, don't get me wrong, and it's like the Packers in the 90s. It's like, Reggie, Reggie White, and it's a very tough and stout team. But we've never been dirty. We've been tough at times and physical, but that doesn't translate to dirty. As far as I'm concerned, if you are tough and physical and show perseverance, you have grit, and grit is one of the single most effective things to have in competitions, as well as life to an extent. But I just wanted to make my opinion on this very clear, that I think that, some people were like, "Oh, this shows that Brock Purdy is so much of a threat." And clearly the starting quarterback is going to be more than a threat on any team than any of the backups. That's why he's the starter. But I don't think the Packers have any intention of trying to injure Purdy. It's not something you want to become known for in the league, because that's just going to provoke other teams to just, maybe, playing with a chip on their shoulder, that like, oh, we want to, breeze by these guys so we can protect our players. We don't want to get in these neck and neck games that ultimately could be decided by an injury. And obviously not all injuries are preventable. They happen on, a number of plays where it's like, oh, it can be non-contact, it can be contact, and it can just be like, even a freak thing between two teammates potentially. But I don't think anybody has the intention on the Packers to injure Brock Purdy. I just don't see it. If that were the case, I feel like, we would have been gunning for Mahomes, when we played them. I feel like we would have been gunning for Prescott a bit more, but there's no play. I think the players on the Packers, if they were asked to do that, would be disgusted with it, and they wouldn't want to play on the team. And you wouldn't have this team that is bought so much into the team culture, be like that. Like, the reason I think that Ndamukong Suh's team was kind of like that was because clearly the Dolphins were in a really, really bad stretch. They were arguably one of the worst teams in the league. That was shortly after, they had drafted Stafford, Megatron, and I had all these top picks. And even I can't remember, I think Ndamukong Suh was like a really high pick as well, if I remember correctly, but was obviously a dirty player. But, when your culture is weak, your team mentality is going to be weak. I'm just going to say that. And, right now we've got honestly 6 teams, I think, that are very strong in culture. I think that you look at the teams that were eliminated. Don't get me wrong. I think the Rams were kind of robbed, and I think that they do have a good team culture. Don't get me wrong, but they just have, a little bit less experience and talent on the team. So it's harder for them to win, even with a guy like Puka Nacua, Cooper, and then Stafford, and then Aaron Donald, of course. But, you look at these teams, and Tampa Bay beat the Eagles, who it has to be more than one thing. I don't think any of us are really going to know until years down the road, when many of these players retire and they start to say like why their team's mental collapse. Because I don't think it was a physical one. I think it was a cultural thing that happened with the Eagles that cannot be explained in one sense. I think there's a ton of variables, because they obviously clearly very, very, very talented. Most of those players would be a starter on like 80 to 90% of other teams, but clearly culturally weak later in the year. And, you look at the Cowboys, I don't know if you could say they were culturally weak, or they just weren't poised to be a team that realized they need to take the Packers seriously, which, to me, that is your intelligence culture. You should never take any game for granted in the NFL. Unless, of course, you're just playing, the worst of the worst teams. But it's like, even my Packers, we almost lost to the Panthers, and that would have been the game that broke the camel's back because clearly my Packers wouldn't have been able to make the playoffs, you know, if we had lost the Panthers. And the Panthers had 2 shutout weeks afterwards, but, they had put up 30 against us. So, the thing about my Packers that I think about what's strong about us is that we don't get to deterred. And I think that the team thinks that they can do anything. And as long as you have and I mean, it might be sound kind of gullible or naive, but if your team is committed to believing you can do something, game after game after game, then that is what builds, you know, build, is a testament to culture itself because clearly no one's ever given up and players have continued to try and improve over the year. Looking at Houston, I think they have a strong culture. Baltimore, of course, a lot of veterans, a lot of guys who have clearly had camaraderie with each other. And, that's why, it's always hard to maintain. Yeah, I think it's hard to maintain culture because you end up getting new pieces and you've got to really get them to kind of buy into the team by the team analogy and that sort of thing. But I think that every team here has good culture. Like San Fran, clearly they've had games where it's like, oh yeah, they weren't full strength. Like without Debo, they were struggling. And clearly a lot of talent there. But Shanahan has a culture where he's brought this team up. And I think that they're way better off this year, culture wise, that even if Purdy gets hurt, they can plug in Sam Darnold, who I don't think he played terribly. I think that obviously being a number 1 overall pick, everyone's going to say his career ultimately was a disappointment, but I think that every team here has great culture. That's kind of my rant about culture and that sort of thing about these teams. Even Tampa Bay, they've rallied behind Baker. They fully support him. The culture of the team is, and they've had emergence from players. Culture brings out the best. And, I think another player that is a culture defining kind of player, out of all these teams is Aaron Jones. Obviously, the running back for my Packers. But the way that he plays hard, you wouldn't think that this guy had missed the amount of games that he had missed, and then he comes back and he's still trying to, get every inch out of his own body, which, has inspired teammates. Like I know there was the little segment of like Jaden Reed saying he's like, I look up to you, brother, referring to Aaron Jones. And he's like, if I don't make a block, a guy like Jaden Reed, a dude who is a slot wide receiver, a smaller guy, has invoked great culture amongst his younger teams. And that is what I think makes younger players better and, advance their learnings and understanding of the game is that culture and these guys that set the bar. There's, nothing that is going to be short of that. And it's like, you've seen it. There were so many times in the Cowboys Packers games, which I'm sure, if anybody watches this, you're more than likely to have watched it because it was 40 million viewers. But you look at that game and you look at how many guys were blocking even downfield after guys had gotten the catch. And then you even look at, I remember seeing Aaron Jones going up and blocking Micah Parsons, which clearly the short Aaron Jones against up the super tall, studly Micah Parsons. And yeah, he had some help from an O lineman, but ultimately without that, it's like probably a sack. And that's, that's my analysis of like the teams that we have right here. And I mean, sometimes teams really suffer from adversity and their cultures like weakened, but overall I think that is something that, is also brought on by, the coaches. But if you guys don't want to talk about anything more, I know this was kind of a shorter one. We're obviously getting to less and less games, but I think, we have a great batch of games this weekend. Otherwise, if you guys have nothing to say or to ask me, I do appreciate you for watching this. I will be posting the 2 games that I have that we have tomorrow, the videos for those, if anybody wants to watch them separately. And then tonight and then tomorrow I'm going to be posting our Sunday matchups. So if you missed, my analysis or analysis is on any of the games, then you could easily look those up. But I want to thank you for watching, and that is this edition of CastCast. And as always, go Pack Go.